Good evening to tonight's session. I hope wherever you are that you're also enjoying a lovely spring afternoon, as I am where I'm situated. Tonight we will be talking about chapter development in your doctoral thesis. If you haven't been to one of my presentations, I'm Professor Jeanette Maritz, and I will be facilitating tonight's session. So I am going to walk you through chapter development, but also how to knit your chapters with the front matter and the back matter. But the main focus will be on your chapter development. So I hope you enjoy the journey with me. I will be putting my camera back on towards the end of the session when we do the questions and answers. And as always, the recordings will be available. If you have queries about recordings, please contact the organizers or Deneo. And I am sure that the PowerPoint will also be available from them. All right, so let's start our journey for tonight. When we look at our chapter and our thesis outline, the first thing that students often ask is, how long should a thesis be? Or when they've done their masters, how long in comparison should it be compared to my masters? So a doctoral thesis has greater breadth and also depth, and we'll talk about that now. It's very important. So the master's and it's wider and deeper than a master's dissertation because it's based on original research. So there's an extra step that comes in over and above what you might have done in your master's dissertation because of this original contribution. So often people or students might think that a doctoral thesis is just, I'm doing maybe what I did in my master's, now I'm just doing more of the same. I'm having a bigger population or more than one context. And all that, though that might be true, and that you still follow the research process. Your master's thesis needs to culminate in a unique contribution, to the body of knowledge. So it's taking basically up to where you would have in your master's dissertation, you would be halfway in your doctoral thesis, because after you have collected your data and analyzed it and interpreted, that is then used towards a unique contribution. So the standard length in a master's dissertation is around 100 pages. Oh, but there's a mistake here. But in a doctoral, so we talk about a doctoral thesis and not a dissertation. Sorry about that. In a doctoral dissertation, it can be up to 250 to 500 pages, or around 80,000 words. So you can see that it's quite a leap from what we might have done in our master's dissertation. So please excuse when we speak about a master's, it's a dissertation, and a doctoral, we speak about a thesis. So let's start with title versus topic, and although I'm sure many of you might understand it, when we talk about our title, it's very important that our title would summarize the main idea or ideas of your study. And a good title contains the fewest possible words that adequately describes your content or the purpose of your research. Usually we would like our titles around 15 words, and that's because of indexing purposes. So please try and have your titles as succinct as possible, and that it's more or less within the 15-word range. You won't get disqualified if it's 16 words, but I would definitely say no more than 18 words. So A topic is simply your research interest or the phenomena under study, but your title summarizes the main ideas or the main content or purpose of your research. So there's more or less an indication for you in terms of the word limit for your title. Now, if you get the following, you would understand the logic behind your chapter development in your thesis. Your chapter follows the structure and layout of the overall research process. So if you understand the logical progress of a research process, the logical flow and layout of your thesis might be clearer for you as well. So your thesis follows the research process. So if we had a brief look at what the research process entails, you would start with a research idea, and that's then usually your topic and then later your title. And you would start your research with an overview, telling the reader what they can expect throughout this process. Now, your second chapter is then usually your literature review, because that's usually the second step in your research process. Now, you might have a literature review chapter and then a theoretical framework that follows maybe in a separate chapter. But it's still part of the logical flow of your research process. Now, your research problem and your research questions usually form part of your chapter 1 here, where you tell the reader what is the background of your study and what you aim to do in your study. So it's part of the planning and operationalization process of the research. Your research design and your data collection and data analysis usually forms part of your chapter 3, your methodology or design and methods chapter, as that is the logical next process in the research process, where you attempt to now answer your research questions. So the next chapter would logically follow the process again when we present our findings or our results. And we then follow with a discussion of our results. Sometimes it's a chapter on its own, sometimes it forms part of this chapter. And then we conclude the research process by reaching certain conclusions and recommendations. So if you keep in mind the logic of the research process, you might also find the logic of our chapter outlines following this research process. So when we talk about the structure of a thesis, it depends upon your field, but it's usually generically there's between 6 to 8 chapters, which includes your introduction and your conclusion chapter for a thesis or for a dissertation. So these chapters is pretty generic, but please remember that it depends on your field, and within a doctoral thesis, it might also depend on your methodology. So if you have, for instance, a mixed methods methodology, you might have additional chapters for your findings, because you might have a chapter that now communicates your results of your quantitative phase, and another chapter that will communicate the results of your findings if it's a qualitative phase of your study. So that might influence, your methodology might influence in the, how many chapters you may have. Depending on your type of study, if you have a literature review or a literature, some type of a literature analysis, like a meta-analysis or a rapid review or systematic literature review, which is quite bulky in your literature review chapter. You might have a separate chapter that talks about theoretical frameworks or the theoretical framework that you used, and that might also then add a chapter. But let's have a look at the generic outline of our chapters, and to understand or just make sure that you're on the right track, please consult with your supervisor. Also consult your department's guidelines and the university guidelines. But what we're going to go through now is a generic outline, and you can then also just check the outline against with your supervisor and then against the departmental guidelines. So the generic structure usually follows the following layout. We usually start with a chapter 1, which is the introduction to your topic. Your chapter 1 gives the reader an overview of your study. So we'll talk about each one in more depth, but usually then chapter 1 is an orientation or an introduction to your study. Chapter 2 usually is your literature review that surveys the relevant sources. And as I said, you might have an additional chapter that discusses your framework of your study, your theoretical framework. Then it's followed by a chapter that addresses your research methodology, sometimes called your chapter design and methods. Now, you can choose either. A methodology means it includes design and methods. But whatever you choose, please just choose it, use the words consistently. If you choose to go with methodology, then speak about methodology throughout. Don't have a heading methodology and then later on you talk about, in other chapters about design and methods. Your methodology would include your design and methods. So choose either. Check with your supervisor, but just use it consistently then. Then once you have your the explanation about the methods and the design that you're following, you would have conducted your research, and then the next chapter would start on reporting of your results or your findings. Now, results, we refer to results in quantitative studies, and we refer to findings in a qualitative study. Or, as I said, if you've got a mixed method study, you might have one chapter that speaks about the quantitative results and another that speaks about the qualitative findings. Or you might integrate the results in one chapter. So that all depends how heavy your chapters will be or might be, whether you've got it all in one or whether you have integrated the findings, could even be in another chapter or an extra chapter. Then it's usually followed by a chapter where you discuss your result or findings. If it's been a mixed method study, you might use this chapter to both discuss and integrate the findings and interpretations of the two phases of your research. Now, following that, very importantly, and this is what distinguishes a thesis from a master's dissertation, is usually a chapter or even more that discusses your unique contribution. What is it that after you've achieved or analyzed your results, what are you doing with that result? So that's the following chapter. And then you would conclude with a final chapter that discusses your conclusion and shows how your research has contributed. So in a generic structure, if everything is pretty straightforward, you would probably end up with 7 chapters. If you have more than one chapter literature, that could add. If you have more complex design, that might add another chapter, but usually not more than eight chapters. So I would say more or less you'll be ending between anything between 6 to 8 chapters for your thesis. So let's have a look now what each chapter might consist of. Your chapter 1, as we said, is your introduction to your study. It presents the core of your research. Now, please remember that you are writing for the reader. Now, your reader in your first reader would be the examiner. So you are actually writing for the examiner. And this is very, very important to keep in mind in your orientation or your introduction chapter. Your examiner for a thesis, you will definitely have one external examiner that is an international examiner. So please keep this in mind when you explain to the reader what your study is about. Please don't assume that if your study took place in South Africa, for instance, that the international reader will automatically understand the context. So be very careful to be very explicit in orientating your reader. And this chapter is a very good place to start to orientate your reader, whether they are national or whether they are international. So every chapter starts with the introduction and every chapter ends with a summary or a conclusion. But the topics that we discuss in between, or your headings in between for your introduction, after you've introduced the study and your chapter, we would usually have a background to the problem, or in some cases you might have an introduction and background where you have both in one heading. So sometimes you might have a heading called introduction and background, or you might split them in two. But the background tells the reader what is the background to the problem. That's usually followed by your problem statement or the statement of the problem. Just a note here is that once we read a thesis, everything seems to be in a logical order, and it follows a specific order. But when we write, we often write as an iterative process. So I often tell my students to first write the problem statement and then write the background. It just somehow works better because very often the students mix information regarding the problem with the background, or the background with the problem. So try and write your problem statement first and then your background, although when you present it, the background is presented first. So again, in the background, please orientate your international reader to the background and explain. After our problem statement, it's usually followed by a heading that says the aim or purpose of the study. So an aim and a purpose is the same thing. You can choose either or, and then your objectives of the study. That's then followed by your research questions or your research hypothesis if it's a quantitative study. You might now want to introduce your reader to your theoretical framework. In chapter 1, however, it's only an overview. You will see from here onwards that most of the aspects is an overview only, because you might have a chapter that deals with your theoretical framework on its own. If you don't, then you can discuss the theoretical framework in this chapter. That's usually followed by a definition of key terms, and then by your research design and methods, or your research methodology. In this case, again, it's only an overview. This chapter is only an orientation. So you're not going to go into depth regarding your design and your methods in this chapter, because there is a chapter dedicated to a full exploration of these aspects. So only an overview. Then your ethical considerations, you might have the ethical considerations in this chapter, or you might have it in your research, design and methods chapter. So you can follow the conventions of your department or your field, or just check with your supervisor whether you're going to have it in this chapter or whether it moves to your methodology chapter. You would definitely have the significance of your study, especially in a doctoral thesis. The significance of the study is very, very important. Yeah, you will need to convince your reader that the study can contribute to the body of knowledge. It might then also follow with your assumptions and the delimitations of the study. Now remember, this is not in chapter 1, it's not the limitations. The limitations will be discussed at the end in your final chapter. So in this, in chapter 1, we only talk about our delimitations, and delimitations might be the boundaries of your study. For instance, did it take place in one specific context? Did you use one specific design? Did you use one specific population, for instance? So these are the boundedness of your study. So it's not yet a limitation because you haven't conducted the study yet. You will reach limitations or be able to talk about limitations in the final chapter. And then, of course, you will have a chapter summary. So more or less the headings that you would find in your chapter 1 and in your overview that you present to your reader. Now, when we look at chapter 2, your chapter 2 usually is your literature review. Whether you do in a thesis, we usually expect our students to do a more complex literature review other than just a regular literature review. It might be a systematic review, it might be an integrative review, but this assesses what the current research says about your topic. So in any literature review, there would be a description of the search of your literature. That would, for instance, entail what search engines you used, and there's many. Google Scholar is a common one, but we'd like the students to use field-specific search engines as well, and there's many, you can find them on the Unisa library. So you will tell your reader what search engines did you use, what keywords did you use, what were the hits that you had, did you use dissertations, did you use grey literature, for instance. So you will tell the reader how you went about to search your literature. Then, as I said, you might have a conceptual or theoretical framework that you might discuss in this chapter, or you might have a separate chapter, or you might have discussed it in chapter 1. It all depends how in depth you're going into the theoretical framework. Then you would discuss the findings of your literature review, and these might then be organized according to your variables or the themes that you found in when you conducted the literature review. Now you will see that I've added here a conclusion. Now the reason why I had a summary in chapter 1 is that it was merely a summary of the chapter. In chapter 2, you can reach a conclusion because you have argued, you've provided evidence, and therefore you can reach a conclusion. But please check this out with your supervisor I often find that that students use the end of a chapter and call it conclusion throughout. But if you think very carefully about it, chapter 1 can't really achieve a conclusion. There was no argumentation, no evidence produced to really reach a conclusion. It's merely a summary of the chapter. But that's my pet horse. Please just check with your supervisor what they prefer. Then we move on to our third chapter, or it might be a fourth if you had a theoretical framework or another discussion. And this speaks to our research methodology. As always, we would have an introduction to the chapter, and we would end the chapter with a summary. You will see here again, it's a summary, not a conclusion. And the next heading you might have is your chosen research design. Your research questions or hypotheses, you might just want to restate them for the reader, just to orientate them so that they can check whether your questions align or that the design aligns with what you aim to uncover or understand. You would then usually have a heading called population, sample and sampling, or you might have 3 separate headings. You might have a heading population, one called sample and one sampling, or a heading called population and then sample and sampling. Just a note, please make sure that the information that you discuss under a heading relates to that heading. I often find students that have a heading called population and then they discuss the sampling under that heading. Or they've got a heading called sample and sampling and then they discuss the population. So please make sure that throughout your thesis, wherever you have a heading, that the information that you discuss under the heading speaks to the heading and not something else. You might then have a heading called Instrumentation, and that usually refers to, in qualitative studies, how you developed your data collection instrument or your interview guide, or in a quantitative study, how you developed your survey, how did you test for validity and reliability. So that's that talks to your instrumentation. Might also speak to if you conducted a pilot interview. We usually don't conduct pilot studies because a pilot study means that you have conducted the entire study in its whole as a pilot, and we seldom do that. We pilot our instruments. Be careful when you use the words pilot study, whether you actually did an entire study or whether you just piloted your instruments like your survey or your interview guide. Then we would move on to a heading called our data collection, and that would speak to telling the reader what form of data collection did you took place. What data collection methods did you choose? You would now discuss them in more depth here than what you did, for instance, in chapter 1. So these would be, what did you choose? Why did you choose this method? What were the advantages, disadvantages, but very importantly, how it was applied. So please note that your examiner knows the theory. They are interested in uncovering how it was applied. So I'm not saying that you shouldn't refer to textbooks and books, but the application is what's very, very important. So please make sure that you discuss in depth how you applied the data collection and how it happened in the practice. So once you've collected your data, please go back to this chapter and add the realities that you faced in the field. Were there challenges, for instance, with getting access to sites? Were there challenges in reaching your sample size? Or were there challenges with getting enough participants, for instance? Please tell your reader about these realities. Did you experience any ethical dilemmas while you collected data? And how did you manage these? The examiner and the reader is interested in knowing this. So it's not just a repetition of or rewriting a chapter in a research methodology book. It's critical that you apply to your research. The same would go for your data analysis. Once you've collected your data, you need to communicate what data analysis method did you use. If it's on both quantitative and qualitative data, it would be two different forms of data analysis. How did you analyze the data? Why did you choose this data analysis method? Were there any challenges in analyzing the data? And again, very important, the application. So often what I find is that the students in their proposal write what data they'll the data collection methods and analysis, and then use it as is in this chapter. It's okay to do that, but you need to go a step further and make sure that you apply once you have actually gone through the process of data collection and data analysis. And then also your measures of rigor or your measures of trustworthiness. Again, you must apply these measures and not just do a theoretical expose of what the textbook says. Very important that you apply and tell the reader each strategy that you used, how was it applied, and if possible, give evidence. I'm specifically thinking, for instance, in measures of trustworthiness. If we speak about credibility, students will often say there was prolonged engagement. Now, as a reader or examiner, I want to know how long was the prolonged engagement that you can state that there was prolonged engagement. You need to tell me, I spent an hour with a participant, or I spent 2 hours with them prior to the interview and then during the interview. So every strategy that you propose, please apply it and tell your reader or your examiner exactly how it was done. If you say you've done a peer review, who were the peers? And please note that your supervisor isn't your peer. A peer would be fellow students, or it might be colleagues in the same field, but you have to apply these aspects. And then you would end with a summary of the chapter. So the big takeaway message of your research methodology or your research design and methods chapter is that you please need to apply and tell the reader what happened in the field. So we don't want a whitewashed account where everything was hunky-dory and that you experience no problems. I then find it very difficult to believe you as an examiner. All right, so just a note on your methods chapter. Once you've collected your data, it's now time to communicate your findings or your results. So this chapter, I often find, or chapters are often the most lengthy chapters in your thesis. Because it's quite a lot of data that you've probably collected, and you now have to condense probably in about 20 to 30 pages the results or the findings of your research. So this chapter also starts with the introduction, and you present your findings or your results. Okay, so sorry about that. Gremlins in the making. So we were talking about chapter 4, and we were discussing how we would present then our findings. And your chapter 4 might be split into 2 chapters. So remember in the beginning we spoke about our research design and our research methodology. So if you had a mixed method study, for instance, you might have 2 chapters that discusses your results and findings. Now you might then, after you have you might have different options, and this is one of the very important options that you need to clarify with your supervisor, and that is around whether you are going to integrate your discussion of your findings within the chapter where you present the findings, or whether you are going to have a separate chapter where you discuss the findings. Now, if you have decided that you are having a separate chapter for your discussions, this might be your following chapter. So you might have had a chapter in terms of quantitative results, qualitative findings, and you might now in the next chapter, for instance, integrate the discussion of your results and findings in your next chapter. Or you might have, for instance, if you have a single design, like a quantitative or a qualitative study, you might have presented your findings in chapter 4, for instance, and you might there discuss your findings as well. So the discussion is where you compare and contrast what your study has found and where you compare and contrast it to previous research. So that discussion might take up another chapter, or you might have decided to integrate your discussion within your data analysis chapter. So if you have done so, then you might not have a separate chapter on discussion, or if you've just presented your research and communication in the previous chapter, you might now have a chapter where you discuss your findings. And again, this would have, you could reach a conclusion, yeah, or you might just have a summary. Now, the next chapter is what differentiates a master's dissertation from a doctoral thesis. And that is the chapter that now talks about your unique contribution. So your unique contribution, for instance, takes place when you have now done something with your results or your findings. So you might have decided to develop a model based on your findings or your results, or you might have, for instance, decided to develop strategies to address the gaps, for instance, that you identified in your when you did your data collection. You might decide, for instance, to write guidelines, or you might develop a program. So the unique contribution is usually very field specific, and what it looks like might be very field specific. Now, if you are in the arts, then your unique contribution might, for instance, be a painting, or it might be a play. But in the sciences, it is often then, for instance, a model, and it might look different from a model in a qualitative study. But this chapter will then present what is your unique contribution to the field of knowledge. So the picture here, for instance, is just a picture of a study of one of my doctoral students that's finishing off now, and she developed this conceptual framework and based on her findings, and she will now, according to this framework, discuss or develop strategies. So the outcome of her study is strategies to address a certain issue or a certain phenomenon. That would be a unique contribution. So your unique contribution might be over one or more chapters, or it's just one chapter, but this chapter is usually what distinguishes your research or your thesis from a master's dissertation. And it's, as I said, it might take various forms, but this is a very important aspect in terms of the development of your doctoral thesis and your presentations. Then we reach our final chapter, and this is where it's sometimes called a summary, implications and outcomes, or it might be called conclusions, recommendations and implications, for instance. So different departments or different fields have a different heading, but this chapter now culminates in bringing together what you said you were going to do in chapter 1. It now needs to provide your reader with the evidence that you have achieved your outcome that you said you were going to in chapter 1. So I often, when I examine a thesis, I will read chapter 1 and then I read the last chapter. And I specifically correlate the two to see what you said you were going to do in chapter 1, if there's alignment with that in your final chapter. And then I start reading the chapters in between to find the evidence that you've actually done what you said you were going to do. So your final chapter will have an introduction to the chapter again. It then might have a summary of your findings. Please, this is a summary, not a complete rewrite of what you did. Based on the summary of your findings or your results, you then reach conclusions, and your conclusions are often then organized by your research questions or your hypothesis or the themes that you had. Then you have your recommendations based on your conclusions. So that's why there's a logic in terms of why we have a summary of the findings. It's so that we can correlate between the findings and the conclusions that we reach. And then our recommendation needs to be based on our conclusions. So I hope that it makes more sense for you why we have these headings in the final chapter, because it forms a part of a logical argumentation. We can't have a conclusion if we don't have findings. We can't have recommendations if we don't have conclusions. So the findings, conclusions and recommendations hold hands, and they need to speak to each other. Now, finally, you have your limitations. Now, here is the time where you can tell the examiner what potential limitations there were. For instance, were you not able to fulfill the sample size that you originally intended to do? Was there limitations in terms of the context of your study? Did you maybe find that your sample size was affected? And so the limitations isn't meant to trip you up or show you up or show you as inadequate. The limitations is simply there to give a future light to possible or potential future researchers that might want to do a similar study, that they know what to look out for and they can maybe improve on or do differently. So don't see the limitations as a negative aspect. You can write it to kind of guide the future researchers as what happened in your research and maybe give them a clearer path. Then you might end with suggestions for future research, and this is based on your argumentation, your conclusions. What would be potential avenues that future researchers could use and move on with? And then finally, there's a conclusion to your study. So this conclusion forms the ultimate end and final thoughts on your entire thesis project. So I often find that once the students reach this part, they are exhausted and the conclusions are very iffy. But please pay attention. You can work on your conclusion throughout your thesis. And as you reach conclusions, you can already, start formulating potentially what would be your final conclusion. So please don't do the conclusion in a haphazard way. It's a very, very important aspect for your examiner and your reader to actually engage in and read. You might decide that this chapter also now has a summary of the chapter again, or you might now just leave it as a conclusion. And that will bring us to the end of all our chapters. So that is your body of work. That is the body that will actually count the most. But we can't just present chapters to a reader. We now need to start knitting all the aspects of the thesis together to present it to our reader. And so I'm going to go through aspects such as your front matter, what goes before your chapters when you present your thesis, and then also what goes after your chapters in terms of completing the entire thesis. Now, when we talk about front matter, we are referring to issues such as your title page, your declaration, your acknowledgements. It's optional, but usually I find that this is a very personal aspect, and you might have either a dedication or acknowledgements, or sometimes both. It will contain the summary of your research and also the table of contents. Now, just in a bit more detail, your title page, this is the critical information that needs to appear on your title page. You will also see that Unisa has very specific guidelines in terms of the exact wording that appears on your title page. Please also have a look at this. But your title page consists of the title of your thesis, the information on the degree, the department, your student name and student number, your supervisor, and the date submitted. So please have a look at the official guidelines, but Unisa has a very specific structure and very specific wording, and you'll find this from either your supervisor, or you will find it on the Unisa information in the library section as well. The next page, your declaration, is a very important page. This is a legal page, so please, you need to sign your declaration physically. You can sign with electronic signature, but you can't just type in your name and surname. This declaration declares that it's your own work and that the sources you've used and quoted have been acknowledged and is complete. You also declare that you submit the thesis, you did do an originality check, and that refers to Turnitin, and it falls within the accepted requirements for originality. And then finally, you declare that you have not submitted this work or any part of it at any other institution or for any other qualification in a higher education institution. And then you would sign and date the declaration. So the wording is pretty much the same. It's the wording that Unisa expects to have in your declaration. Then we said you might have an acknowledgement page. Now this page is a very personal page. It doesn't have a specific structure, and this is a page where you can now from the heart speak and acknowledge or dedicate your research to. So there's no prescribed requirements. You can, for instance, acknowledge your supervisor, your family, your friends, your spouse, research support that you received. Or if it's a dedication, I often find that Students dedicate their research to maybe someone that inspired them, or other family members that's passed, but this is a very personal aspect that you can design and dedicate as you would like. Then a very important aspect is your table of content. You typically have your table of content, which is then followed by at least 2 lists. There might be more. You'll have a list of figures and you'll have a list of tables. You might also have a list of acronyms. But at the very least, it would be the table of contents, the figures and tables. Now, please don't have your table of content that you drew up manually. It leads to problems, it leads to omissions, and it doesn't work well. So I've added a link for you to watch a YouTube video where it shows you how to use the features in MS Word, for instance, that would help you to create a table of content. So please, there's more than this one, but please don't draft your table of content manually. When you've got it on a formatted way, it will automatically change, for instance, page numbers if you've done revision, or if you change headings. So please don't do it manually. It's then followed by your summary of your abstract of your research, and your abstract needs to be able to stand alone. So it would need, at the very least, your research questions and aims, your methodology, your findings, and your conclusion. Now, there is a word limit in terms of the abstract for the Unisa guidelines, and the reason for the word limit is that it also has to do with the indexing. So please read the Unisa guidelines. It's either 200 or 350 words, and Unisa also requires you to translate your abstract in at least one more of the official languages in South Africa. I've also had students that have done research in international context, for instance, in Saudi Arabia, and then they've translated in Arabic as well. But please, again, follow the Unisa guidelines in terms of the number of words that's allowed for the abstract, for indexing purposes. And now, key terms. Unisa also has a guideline that requires you to have 10 keywords. So very important, your key terms. You would definitely need all the words in your title. So this is just an example of a title. Nicely fits into the 15-word limit. And your key words would be the words in your title, or maybe any other related keywords. So for instance, if we talk about mathematical achievement, for instance, psychometric measures might be a different term that they might refer to when speaking about mathematical achievement, or diagnostic tests, for instance. You can now also use your key terms to be more specific. If your title says university students, you might have in your key terms that it's first-year university students, or that it is university students in a certain field of study, for instance. You might now also include, for instance, if your findings found that there is anxiety and personality factors these might now come into your 10 keywords. Now, it's very important. Your keywords is so important because they would get feet or eyes on your research. So if someone was researching a similar topic, then they might put in some of these keywords, and we would like them to find your research. So be very careful and thoughtful in terms of the keywords that you choose in terms of your final dissertation. Now, the back matter is the aspects that come after you have finished your presentation of your chapters. So it would then include your references, and we'll speak a bit about that now, and then also your annexures. Now, your annexures might include the ones that I've listed below, or it might include more than these, but at the very least, it would be your ethical clearance letters or your permission letters from sites. But you have to have your ethical clearance so that the examiner can check that your study had ethical clearance. They can also check which date it was issued, when you collected data, that it wasn't outside of these parameters that the ethical clearance granted you. So very important, you will have to have your ethical clearance letters. Then you might have non-disclosure agreements. So if you used any external people, say for instance, a statistician or a co-coder or a transcriber or an editor, we ask them to sign non-closure agreements. That means that they will not speak about your content, your data to anyone outside. So it's also called a confidentiality agreement. Then it might include also an example of your interviews or your guidelines, or the instrument that you used. You would attach that as an annexure. In a qualitative study, attach at least one transcribed interview. And I usually tell the students to choose their best interview that demonstrates all the skills they said they were going to use in their data, or when they collect their data. If I now read the original transcribed interview, I can see whether you used your research questions, whether you used the follow-up probes, how long the interview was, and I can now actually see that you applied what you said you were going to do in your data collection section of your chapter 3, for instance. And then definitely your editor's letter to state that your thesis has been professionally edited. So at the very least, these are your annexures. There might be more. Your references, a very, very important aspect. You need to make sure that your references are sufficient and comprehensive, that they are used correctly according to the accepted conventions of your department or the university. So the university has their reference guidelines on the Unisa library, but you might find that your department uses a different reference guide or a reference convention. I'm thinking specifically, for instance, the Department of Psychology. I think they use the APA 7th edition, for instance, reference convention, where the university, for instance, uses Harvard. So whichever one you use, please make sure and check with your supervisor as well which convention is subscribed to in your department. Make sure that it's technically correct in terms of your bibliography requirements, and that it ensures effective retrieval. What we mean by effective retrieval, for instance, if you've used internet sources, that you make sure that the links that you provide are still active and alive. So I would, just before you hand in, go to all the links, make sure that they're still active and that you can still access them. The references to your journals, that they are accurate and that they can be retrieved. Most journals now ask that you have a DOI number following your reference, and that's simply for correct retrieval. And then very important, the same as with your table of content, please use a electronic reference management system, such as Mendeley, RefWorks, EndNote. There's quite a number. I think the most popular is Mendeley, RefWorks, or EndNote, but there are many others, and please just note that, for instance, here's a comparison of what this software can do and with which it's integrated. Please note that, for instance, EndNote or RefWorks, that you can access it for free via Unisa. So Unisa has paid these, we've got licensing fees, so there is no cost to you. But it's very, very important that you please use electronic referencing techniques. Some students use the reference in the Word document. I find it a bit problematic because it still means that you need to actually write in all the information and you might do it incorrectly. So please, from the beginning, start using a reference that's subscribed to and that you can manage your references. It takes an enormous amount of time once you are ready to submit to now go and look for references. So please get it right from the beginning. I'm going to end off with just some evaluation criteria that you can now just go back and check at the very least that you have covered the following aspects. So ask yourself and do a self-assessment. Does my title contain the key concepts developed in the thesis or dissertation? Does the thesis chapter hang together? That means that there's a logical flow. There's a logical flow between your chapters. There's a logical flow within your chapters. There's also a logical flow between your paragraphs, and that even on paragraph level, that your paragraphs hold hands, that you have your paragraphs with linking sentences, and that your writing hangs together, your chapters hang together, and that your final thesis hangs together. Then does my introduction guide the reader about my research structure and scope? And that's why we have an introduction to each chapter. That introduction helps to tell your reader what is the structure and scope of that chapter. And then chapter 1 gives the overall structure and scope of your entire thesis. Is there a sense of an argument developing in my thesis? Do I guide my reader by making links between the different sections and subsections? So tell your reader the following paragraphs will discuss A, B, and C, and then discuss A, B, and C, and then discuss it in the order that you told the reader that they will find it in. Don't tell your reader you're going to discuss the population sample and sampling, and then you start the first heading with sample. So please, even on a very micro level, please ensure that there is a logical coherence to whatever you do and present. Then finally, do your headings and subheadings encapsulate the meaning of the text that follows the headings and vice versa. And that's what I referred to earlier on, that you please make sure that what you have under your heading the content relates to the heading and not to something else. So that's been quite a mouthful. I'm going to just briefly show you two books that you could use. The one is on academic writing. It's an older book, but I find that it's a very easy book to help you in academic writing. I always say that English is most of us' second language, but academic writing is no one's first language. We all need help. We all need development with academic writing. So please read some books, practice your academic writing, attend training. It's so critical that you are able to communicate with your reader. You could have done the most amazing research, but if you can't communicate and write it well, then you have lost a lot. So please develop in terms of academic writing, attend courses, read about it, practice it. And this is just a reasonably cheap little book that could really help you on even on sentence level with your academic writing. And then there's just another book, Preparing Your Doctoral Studies and Doctoral Education. It's not that expensive, and it would really guide you through your doctoral journey. It talks about things such as time management, also your structure, your layout, challenges that you might meet, how to overcome them. So I recommend strongly that you get either one or both or similar books. So your reading in terms of your doctoral journey, you read a lot of literature, you read a lot of research methodology. You also need to read on preparing you for your doctoral journey, and you also need to read and practice on academic writing. So that brings us to the end of the presentation. Just with a final word, please enjoy the journey and not just the destination. When you start off with a doctoral journey, you are journeying for 4 to 7 years. It's a very, very long journey to wait for the end when you are capped. So please enjoy the short victories that you have as you progress with your studies. Short victories when you've received ethical clearance, when you've collected your data, when you've got nice feedback. And please remember that feedback is only that. The supervisor isn't taking anything or writing anything that means it's personal. You are simply getting feedback. So don't take it too personally. And then enjoy those small victories until you finally can hand in your thesis that is nicely coherent, logic, and meets all the requirements with an amazing, unique contribution for which you will be known in your field as the expert in. So that's what I have to say in terms of the official presentation. I'm just going to stop sharing and then turn on my camera, and let's see if you had any questions that I can maybe just clarify for you or just explore a bit better. I'm just waiting for the questions to load. Okay, where could I access the Unisa guidelines for master's dissertation or for the doctoral thesis? You will find it on the your Unisa on the Unisa website. You will also find it on the Unisa library. Or you could ask your supervisor for those as well, but they are available on the Unisa website. I think if you go under, you'll find them under policies. You'll also find them under student matters, the M&Ds, but they're also available on the library website. And if you really struggle and you can't get hold of them, pop me an email. I'll also give it to you. But please try the other sites first, okay? Samuel asks, is it possible to have one chapter for the results and findings in mixed methods? Yes, you could. For example, where you start with the findings of the qualitative and then go over to show triangulation in one chapter. Yes, Samuel, you can definitely do that. Just be careful that the chapter doesn't become very heavy. But you can most definitely, if you can find it, fit it into one chapter, then most definitely you can. My caveat would just be, please just watch out for the chapter getting on the heavy side. All right, let me just see. I see there's 7 questions. Oh, I went to the last. The PowerPoint presentation is there. Samuel, when it comes to chapter 2, that's the literature review, do we start with the theoretical and conceptual framework, or do we start with the literature review? That's really up to you. It could be either. All right, it's up to you which you'd like to start with. Also, maybe ask your supervisor, but it's neither here nor there. You could choose. This was a question I think that was posted the other night as well. Is the final conclusion chapter the same as the discussion? No, it's not. At your discussion, you refer to, it's the discussion about your findings or your results, and your discussion is where you compare and contrast your findings with previous research. So what did you find? Is it the same? Is it different from other research? So the discussion chapter is a chapter on its own, and the final conclusion chapter is where you discuss, it gives a summary of your findings, where you discuss your conclusions reached, your recommendations based on those conclusions, future recommendations for future research, and your limitations. So I know it was asked in the previous section, in the previous presentation on Tuesday night for the master's students, but just to answer that, if they may be listening again, it's 2 different chapters. Do you have to attach the original transcript when submitting the dissertation to examiners? Original transcription? Yes. Please just know whether it's the verbatim transcription that you made. Very important to de-identify any persons mentioned. So please remove any names or any identifiable information. But that would be the verbatim transcript that you used or that emanated from your interviews and that you transcribed. So yes, that would be the original transcription, but you do take all identifiable information from that transcript. Then, Henry, I hope that I have answered your question in terms of where you could find it. It's on the Unisa site, also in the Unisa library site, but I can definitely also send it to you. Okay, I'm just going to quickly refresh this button just to see if there was maybe any more. Sometimes I find that I go out and then there are some questions that still follow. Okay, I'm not sure if there's any more questions. If there's still maybe a final thought or I haven't answered you properly, you're also welcome to still pop a question in there. Otherwise, I think we might have come to the end of the presentation. So I'm just giving you up. There's one more. Let's see. Henry, thank you. You're welcome. Okay, if there isn't then any other questions, I thank you for attending tonight. Thank you for bearing with me when I lost connectivity. It was the first time that happened. Even when I had load shedding, we didn't have that challenge. So sorry for the few minutes wait and that I needed to reconnect. I hope that it didn't hinder you in terms of the logical flow that we discussed. Then all the best with your studies. I hope that the process is maybe a bit less daunting to you and that you might have a bit more clarity in terms of the expectation regarding the chapter development. All right, from my side then, nice evening. Take care. Bye-bye.